So now we'll get to the panel section. Our panel will consist of both Dr. Leu as well as Dr. Sahin, to call on Dr. Ann Bruno, who is a professor in Obstetrics and Gynecology at Utah Health. Also, Dr. Tamara Lewis, who's a physician scientist at the Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, Canada. We have Dr. Nachman, Sara Nachman. Oh, there she is. She is the chief of the Division of Pediatric Infectious Diseases at Stony Brook. We have Dr. Christina Bucci-Rechtweg, who's online, who is the Global Head of Pediatric and Maternal Health Regulatory and Development Policy at Novartis. And our panel today will be moderated by Dr. Sara Quinney, who is a professor of obstetric and gynecology here at IU, as well as Gary Moore, who is the director in global PKPD at Eli Lilly. Please give a round of applause for our panel and welcome them.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you. Gary, do you want to start with the first question?
Thank you all for joining with us. I just want to introduce myself in behalf, not just from that I work at Eli Lilly, I'm also part of the IQ Consortium CPLG Pediatric Work Group. And I really want to thank Christina for bringing us this attention to the E21 guideline, as she's been involved in this process, and to get our participation. Our mandate is to be the advocacy voice for the industry for pediatric care, and this is definitely a topic very closely related to us. And so thank you all from our members for participating, Jocelyn and Christina, but also thank you, Sara, for letting us get involved in this very important process.
Great. Thank you, Gary.
I'd like to start with the first question for our panelists, right? Now that we have the guideline out there, what is a really good starting point? How can organizations better prepare themselves to adopt this guideline? How are these differences based on different drug types, therapeutic areas? What are the most readily adoptable area that you can think of for the E21 principles?
Do you want to call on us?
Oh, so I'll start, I'll take the hit for the team. So first, anyone in the room that wants to read them, I brought the guidelines with me. So I figured you had, 40 pages of light reading tonight before bed, I have a copy. I think the most important part about the guidelines is actually just knowledge-based, is telling everyone they exist and saying this is an expectation. So we take it from behind the curtain, behind in the back room, to something that we expect that everyone would know. For me, knowledge is important, and knowledge that the guidelines exist. And I want to say politely, we're seeing multiple groups around the world writing guidelines. The UK group just came out, the Liverpool group just came out, WHO just came out. I mean, this is not a unique set of guidelines, and what's interesting about all the guidelines is they say the exact same thing. So I think that knowledge is important, and assuming that someone has read it would be the wrong approach. We want everyone in the group here, all of us, to say, do you know they exist? These are what should be followed, as opposed to kind of assuming someone read them.
I'll go next. I'm Tamara Lewis. I'm a neonatologist and pediatric clinical pharmacologist at Sick Kids. One really important first step, I think, is to have dedicated training for research ethics boards, because it really is quite a large paradigm shift for the ethics boards who review these protocols to move from protecting moms to protecting moms through research. And it might be too much of an ask for every single REB at every institution to have the adequate training to really understand the nuances of pregnancy and lactation clinical trials. So another model may be to have a more centralized REB type system that has that specific expertise, and that local REBs could either consult with or rely upon in order to really understand that it is safe and it is important to include these populations in clinical trials. And one, I think, important part of that is to bring patients with lived experience in front of the ethics boards. Because if you speak to women who have been pregnant or who have lactated and just really agonized and suffered over the utter lack of data to guide their decisions, it's a very different story that you would hear from those patients about their willingness to take on what might be overinflated perceived risk from the REB perspective. So I think getting patients with lived experience in front of or as part of those ethics boards would be really important also.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can comment. My name's Bruno. I'm a maternal-fetal medicine physician and a clinician scientist at the University of Utah, and I fully agree with everything that's already been said. I do think that patients are on board with this. I think that academic clinicians and researchers are on board with this, and so I think one thing that I am excited about is that this, I think, really pushes the sponsors and companies more forward with regards to following this, because I think that forever, it seems, that we have been told on the clinical side that companies don't want to invest in research in pregnant and lactating individuals because of these safety concerns. And so I think that knowledge is important, and think that we're catching up after many decades of being behind. And so what needs to happen next, I think I already agree with what's been said, but I think the academic centers, IRBs, patients are on board, and so happy to see the FDA and push sponsors.
Gary, I'm happy to speak on behalf of industry. This is Christina, and thank you to our speakers before for setting up the panel. From an industry perspective, I think there's a couple of things, and I think Sharon, you spoke about the number one, which is socialization of the fact that this guidance is moving forward, and it's moving forward on a global scale. So what's been happening internally, I'll speak for my company only, is that is exactly what we've been doing for the last few years, is socializing this concept that this is coming, and how can we as an organization be prepared for a true culture change in how we evaluate medicines for pregnant women. So I think that's number one. But I think that there are some realities on the ground that we also need to be prepared for. And that's that this won't be an overnight change, because even though Leyla beautifully highlighted the guidance that's been out there, FDA has been kind of preparing the roadmap for us in the US, no parallel guidance exists in any other region. So US is it so far. So the ICH guidance will be a shock to systems pretty much everywhere outside of the United States, because there aren't any existing guidance elsewhere. And even within the inclusion guidance that's at FDA, it still speaks to the fact that foundational data is needed. It still speaks to the fact that generally phase 1 and phase 2 data will be needed before we can consider the inclusion of pregnant women in clinical trials. And that's phase 1 and phase 2 data from studies that have been inclusive of women of childbearing potential. And so I think that these are pieces that we all need to be prepared for. It is going to have a gradual momentum until the mechanism has been built for these types of programs to really take off and move forward. I think the second thing is that there is fundamentally, and I think that this is a really critical piece, a general lack of infrastructure to support the vast scope of animal studies that will be necessary to move forward in the earlier phases of development. There will need to be prioritization of non-human primates for those programs that rely on non-human primates for studies. And so this won't be an overnight piece, but there will be a need for infrastructure to be adequately aligned to support these types of trials. And then I think finally, the vast majority of studies that will be impacted by E21, since its inclusion of pregnant women in existing development programs, or inclusion of lactating women in existing development programs, the majority of those programs are not being conducted by the obstetric and gynecology research community. The vast majority of those programs are being conducted by other therapeutic areas. And there is a very large lack of interconnectivity, with the exception of certain areas, such as Sharon in your area, in your field, there's excellent interconnectivity, but that does not exist in most therapeutic spaces. And so there needs to be also the academic cultural shift of collaboration with obstetric and gynecologic researchers so that we can adequately support any researcher who's involved in a non-pregnancy space and also the patients that would be enrolled. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Just want to give out a commercial message here. So I'm the PI for the maternal child HIV TB clinical trial unit. So that's what you're hearing about. So in the HIV and TB world, the clinicians, the pharma, FDA, EMA, boots on the ground researchers all sit in the same room all the time, every day of the week kind of thing. And shout out to Rob Bees, who's our pharmacologist extraordinaire, who sits on maternal child studies with us. So just to let you know that it can happen. It takes the will to have it happen, but it absolutely can happen. And, you know, I feel sad sometimes when I hear that it's not happening in other fields, because our HIV field is not an old field, our TB field is certainly not old, but we're doing it. So it can happen.
Sure.
Yep, thank you. So I know you, Tamara, picked up a little bit on the ethics guideline, and I think on getting through what our current ethics review frameworks, are they equipped to handle these studies and evaluate them appropriately in pregnant and breastfeeding individuals?
I can take that one to start with. I would say yes and no. This sort of goes back to the IRB comments that were made. I think for those of us who are at institutions that are doing research already in pregnant and lactating individuals, are very comfortable and used to getting projects like this through the IRB and have the support of our departments and patients locally. I do think, though, that there is still sometimes some pushback to the old paradigm of vulnerable populations. And we have seen that change over time, I think, at different academic institutions. But there still is a need, I would say, for education across IRBs for all the points that were brought up earlier to really try to continue to push this, because I think right now it varies a lot by institution to institution as to how adaptive they've already become around sort of changing that historical paradigm.
The other thing I'll add is that for a lot of drug studies, especially new molecular entities, there is going to have to be some amount of reliance on in silico tools and modeling and simulation in order to understand theoretical risk. And so right now I would say, you know, most IRBs aren't like familiar with concepts of PBPK modeling and sort of the reliability of that and maternal-fetal drug exposure metrics. So, you know, there's going to be quite a bit of just like foundational learning required to understand the tools that are being used to estimate fetal exposure and sort of how the sponsor and the PIs think about that in order for the ethics boards to feel comfortable, because the average person on the ethics board is going to think the first question they're going to have is, you want to give this drug to a pregnant mom, how much is going to get to the fetus? That's going to be their first question. So, you know, how do they understand that, and how do we explain that to a group of non-pharmacologists in a way that's very digestible and easy to understand?
Thank you very much. That actually brings us to a really good point. The data from a lot of these there could be gaps that can be filled by modeling, but there's RF data sources out there. And in the guidance itself, it discusses and recommends using weight of evidence arguments that we could present to justify some of these studies. How do you guys see, how do we integrate that data? For example, preclinical, available clinical data, modeling, as well as real world evidence data to help inform these decisions?
I'll take the hit on that one. I guess the first question sometimes that I want to understand is, what's the disease and what's the urgency of the study? You know, some of them, like when we had our Mpox outbreak, we didn't sit there and say, oh, we're going to give tecovirimat, which was the approved drug at that time, to everyone except the pregnant and lactating women. They can just have their Mpox. Actually, in fact, the US study that was sponsored by NIH, ACTG, and Impact enrolled everybody at the same time. Children, infants, pregnant, postpartum, adults, you name it, everybody came in at the same time. So I think it have to balance the urgency of what you're doing with, I want to say, the need and trying to understand how to get that information. So there is some balance on that. And I think the second thing is that we are very smart these days about not only modeling, there's lots of pregnant women, PK models, lots of postpartum pre-K models, and that data can easily be shared across, so you're not starting from scratch developing a PK model. And then the third is we are very smart on molecules and how they are similar. You know, is it the R1, R2 groups in antibiotics? Is it some other structure of the medication? Does that represent, or is it similar to some other model that we do have data on? So I think there are gaps that can be filled, and then there's the unknowns. You're right. But I think saying that everything is unknown is probably not realistic.
Thank you.
I'll ask one more question and then we can open it up to the audience for questions and input and feedback as well. But I think, you know, I know at least Sharon and the panelists have a critical view of the ICH guidelines and have examined them. Can you think of any critical gaps in ICH E21 that requires further guidance or further clarification? Which I know is a big question, but maybe a place to start with our more open discussion then.
Do you want to ask the FDA?
Maybe, Leyla, do you have any comments, maybe based on some of the feedback you've seen of where we're moving for?
Yeah, sure. The comments were submitted, you know, in a public fashion, so it's okay for me to talk about the types of comments that we received. One of the comments that we received was that there's only one sentence in the guidance related to trials that are being conducted for the benefit of the fetus. So exactly what Jocelyn was talking about. And so we received several comments that say, you know, that are asking for further expansion, and that, you know, just having one line, one sentence in this guidance doesn't really do justice, you know, to the therapeutic need for, you know, to treat fetuses. And so that was one comment that we received. So we're considering that. Interestingly, on the US side, we received comments that, you know, the language and the guidance needs to be stronger, needs to be strengthened, and that, you know, that there needs to be a strong message that pregnant women should be empowered, you know, to make their own decisions when it comes to participation in clinical trials. And so that's a little bit difficult because, you know, this is my first experience working in a global environment. And so where there are certain regions of the world that are, you know, not of the same mindset as the US. And so even, for example, related to consent form, certain regions of the world, you know, they have other people, other family members involved when it comes to consenting. So it's not just the woman. She's not really independent in certain areas of the world. And, you know, the mother-in-law or other family members may be involved. And so it's a really interesting experience to work with, you know, folks from all around the world who have different perspectives on these issues. And Sharon, you've worked globally, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts and your experience about working in a global environment where there may be differences in thinking on these issues.
Yeah, we often have the problem that the father of the child, as well as the mother of the child, has to sign consent. And there's a very slippery slope about open the door to the clinic office and go, oh, is the dad here? No, he's not here. Okay, dad is not available. Mom, please sign the consent and you're done. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of, you know, is this really the dad's child? Is it the product of a rape? Do we know who the dad is? And that becomes even more of a slippery slope. So we have followed the IRB guidelines for each country that do, I want to say, require, suggest, recommend the dad consent. We, thank God, have not had any mother-in-law consent, so I'm kind of happy about that. Certainly, they are a force to be listened to, but they don't have to sign a consent. But we have really erred on the side of the mom is in control, and she's the one who's pregnant, and, try to really make sure that she is the primary person, understands the consent, understands the study, understands the rationale, and is able to sign. But we have occasionally found families that the dad had to sign, didn't know the mom was HIV positive, went out and killed the mom. And that obviously looks bad on the clinical trial side, never mind anything else. So I want to say there's a very, very fine line between encouraging the mom, involving the dad, not involving the dad, or not knowing who the dad is.
I would just add to that on the US side from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and sort of from an OB perspective that the general ethical guidance would be that a non-gestational partner does not need to sign consent for a maternal-based study, even if it is for fetal benefit, for some of these reasons highlighted privacy and confidentiality and bodily autonomy.
Christina?
Yeah, thanks. I think in general, it's my understanding that the industry reception has actually been quite good of the ICH E21. And for those not familiar with ICH, just as Leyla really nicely pointed out, this is both regulatory agencies globally and the major trade organizations globally to talk about how you generate information that's going to be acceptable for purposes of a benefit risk evaluation ultimately at the time of submission. So industry's also been involved in the development of this guideline. That doesn't stop industry from having perspectives in the public consultation. And I know, Leyla, you've seen all of those comments that have come in. So I think that there are two potential areas that really need to be thought about pretty clearly. And the first is that this is a guidance that is about inclusion. It is not a guidance about any other topic except inclusion. And in fact, the ICH, that is what was accepted in the concept paper that came through for this guidance. And for all of us who are in this community, we want it to be much more than it can be. And so I think that that is one of the potential difficulties of this guidance, is that we know that there are other topics that also need to be addressed and probably need their own dedicated guidance instead of trying to shove it all in to one. I think the other piece is that it is clear that there is a difference between inclusion of pregnant women and inclusion of lactating breastfeeding women. And they have different needs. And there's different types of studies and very different ways of doing inclusion for those populations that could efficiently get us to the finish line. And then I think the third piece of that is, at times the guidance does seem to imply studies for pregnant women. And that's not what this guidance is, because remember, just as Leyla really nicely pointed out, the vast majority of products, when they're authorized, if there's no direct contraindication for use in pregnant populations, they can be used. So our intention should be here, what's the data that needs to be generated that helps us to better inform efficacious dose, the proper clinical pharmacology across the trimesters of pregnancy, and then ultimately informs on benefit risk, both to mom and benefit risk to fetus. And it doesn't necessarily mean dedicated studies. It means what would be the sufficient set of information to help us get to a place where we feel better informed. So I think that that's one of the pieces of the guideline, I think based on the comments that I saw that were coming from the public consultation, will help to shape and get us there. Like, what is that set of information? What is that set of information that better informs the ultimate determination on benefit risk? And I don't know, Leyla, if you wanted to respond to that since you're the rapporteur.
What is the data? I mean, I think that's a complicated question. And because, yeah, there's no one size fits all, and every product is different and has different considerations, and so many factors need to come into consideration. So, yeah, it's not an easy answer.
Okay. Thank you all. We can now move to audience questions.
Hi, David Haas from here at IU. You actually set up the first of my two-part questions about lactating participants. And we heard a little bit yesterday about, we were limited by 6-month-old samples. I'm curious what conversations have been having about inclusion and sample collection for those in the very early part, when there's only a little bit of colostrum in the first few days, and that balance between we've got to feed the baby and we really need the information about the medication transfer into breast milk. So I'm interested in what conversations have been happening about that, sort of those first few weeks of breastfeeding, and how do we get those data well for these people who are included. And the second question is, one of the things that's plagued us in obstetrics for a really long time is that we sort of checked out once we handed the baby to the pediatrician. And I'm wondering with this new impetus to include more pregnant individuals in these studies, is what happens in the uterus doesn't end in the uterus, and it has lifetime implications for both mom and baby. So is there going to be, and I would advocate that there needs to be, more emphasis on funding long-term longitudinal follow-ups of these folks so that we can understand the impacts of the exposure in utero on the children as they develop?
I'll take that one. So the answer is yes. PREGLAC, among other groups, has talked about registries and what kind of a registry would you need, how would you design it, and how to keep track of the mother-baby dyad so that we actually were able to follow these families longer. The problem, as you can imagine, is of course funding, because funding a registry, so we have an antiretroviral registry, which we're pretty good at, people putting their data in and following up and hearing toxicities. But if the baby is fine, people don't want to enter anything into the registry. The kid's fine, what's the question? So setting up a registry for new drugs, new indications, pregnant women, postpartum, and follow-up is a very, very big hill to climb. And I don't know that anyone has really solved it. You know, in this AI group and with all the other, PCORNet type studies, PCORNet is a, national database-driven kind of study that may be a way around having registries. On the other hand, with AI tools, we may not need a registry, but we need to synergize the data collection ability of all the EMRs that we have out there.
I'll try to speak briefly to the breast milk issue. So as a pediatrician, I do understand that delicate balance between prioritizing giving that early milk to the infant versus doing, pharmacology studies. But I think one space there's a lot of room for innovation is in microsampling techniques and just further developing our assays such that we can learn what we need to learn from very tiny volumes. So like even a 48-hour-old infant can nurse until they're satisfied, and then the mom could pump immediately after. And the mom may not get a substantial volume of colostrum after the infant's done feeding, but if they could get 50 microliters or 100 microliters, that's very plausible. So there are ways to do it. I think we just need innovation in the sort of mass spec space to use smaller and smaller volumes with high reliability.
And then I'll just piggyback on that. Actually, we just had this conversation within the past week at our company. And I think we just need to be smarter about opportunistic opportunities. Bottom line, across the board. We're talking about in this guideline, both inclusion of pregnant patients and inclusion of lactating patients. So any trial that's going to be inclusive of pregnant patients could consider a sub-study to allow the women who are enrolled in the trial to stay on for a sub-study for lactation in those first few days where you're going to have colostrum. I mean, in the United States, unfortunately, we have a large population that has no interest in breastfeeding. So we have opportunities with patients, whether they're planning to breastfeed or not, with the lactation piece, where patients may be interested in providing that information. We've found that most of our clinical subjects really want to help other women in their position or really want to help other patients in their positions. So I think we need to be also really creative in trial design and sub-study design to help us generate some of this information that's historically been very difficult to obtain. But I mean, it's a great question that you've asked.
Thank you. Tom Callahan. It's a little bit complicated. I hope you'll bear with me. I think we all agree that this is incumbent upon us to create an environment where people taking medications no matter what their variability reasons are exposed to drugs that are safe. I have some strong opinions on the real value of modeling. I think it's a great way to get into precision medicine, but it only is a biomarker of exposure. If we're going to really understand the risk to our patients, we need to do at least the PK/PD aspects of the exposure. So that would be one thing. The other piece of it is, if we're going to take mean data and say it's safe for the patient, those of us who deal with precision medicine think it's probably that group of individuals that are above the mean exposure, and really those are the people we need to cover for our side effect issues. So that's one aspect of it. I think that means we need to be more incumbent about studying animals who are only single strains, and recognize the fact that we need to have some other indicators, like were mentioned this morning, other ways of looking at trying to get human data and look at a varied exposure with that data. And finally, the last piece, the early slide mentioned the liability issue. These are all barriers, and the issue about liability, I think, is important for us to remember. Diethylstilbestrol came on the market and eventually was used secondarily as a way of exposing women for early delivery. And what had happened was, obviously, it didn't affect the mothers, but it affected the children years later. So there was a long-term risk for the individuals there. Same thing, if you will, with thalidomide and things like that. And remember, today we have a climate where we're saying that the vaccines are causing autism. And as Dave said, we need to study the behavioral aspects of this thing so we understand the long-term risks. So how do we get to that? Well, if liability is an issue, why don't we take something like PDUFA and add some extra funding to it and create a wealth of money that is available for the patient that happens to get into a risky problem under drug studies, and thus doesn't have to get a lawyer and go through years of litigation in order to be repaid. It seems to me it's incumbent upon us in academia, in clinical medicine, in the pharmaceutical industry, and in government to actually come up with a way that we can make it and facilitate and get over these particular barriers. Thank you.
I have one brief response to the issue of the need for longitudinal follow-up, because I've been thinking a lot about that. I think for these types of studies, if we're going to really enroll pregnant women on a large scale into drug studies, we're going to need some more collaboration with community pediatricians to follow these kids long term. It's not feasible to think that a study physician is going to see every baby born out of a drug trial for 2 years. It's just not feasible. So I think there's a real opportunity to be creative in how do we partner with community pediatric practices so that they can follow the children and be the early detection signals for any concern. So almost like a tiered follow-up, where a pediatrician seeing these children very frequently the first 2 years, based on them being in a trial, maybe they could have a list of things that they're looking out for. And then if the pediatrician detects a signal, that's when it gets escalated to a study physician or XYZ. So I think there's going to have to be some innovation in sort of the paradigm of follow-up, where it's more community-based. A central research coordinator is checking in with these pediatricians that are seeing these infants that are products of the drug trials. But we're not going to be able to do this sort of the old way if we really want to do it at scale at some point.
Hi, my name is Sara Celestin Cherry. My question is, I want to thank Dr. Leyla for bringing up the global perspective in regards to maternal health or pediatric health, because my husband and I started a program. It's a doula program where we train doulas that are bilingual. So therefore, each doula that is trained based on your language, you go back into your own community and assist the mom, because we're able to have our doulas be with moms from pregnancy, labor, delivery, from baby's first birthday from baby's first week home to first birthday. But what we realize is, in a global perspective, even though, yes, I was born in one country, but a lot of our moms that we work with are from different cultures, different backgrounds. So we realize that by having our doulas going back to help their own communities, I have learned so much into different approaches of childbirth and how to take care of a baby, because each culture is different. And growing up here, one thing I have learned is I had my kids 17, 22, and 23. They're 27, 22, and 20 now. But that was over almost 3 decades ago. And my culture was not viewed as important during labor and delivery, during my process of bringing a baby home, where at home I knew culturally these are the things I was supposed to do. So me and my husband, I'm his biggest challenge. We go back and forth a lot because he collects data. He can tell you how many vaginal births that our doulas have been a part of, C-section, or any complications. But for me, we lose sight at times of the community aspect. Even though we are here and there are laws being made, guidelines being set, but if we all come from different cultures, how do you approach each culture individually so you could actually be able to be present for mom and baby? So that's the work I do, because I view it from a different lens, from a more non-American perspective.
So I take the hit on that one. So you have to realize that there's the dichotomy between getting an informed consent, which is 25, 30 pages long, written in 10 font, versus making sure the family understands what the study is about, what the consent is about. And many of us use community advocacy as part of clinical trial development, informed consent. So we've actually developed flip charts. So flip charts for informed consent, so they cover the exact same topics, but they are culturally appropriate to the country and the city, site, whatever that we're doing the study in. So I want to say there's been a huge advance in making sure that we are speaking in the same language, using the same jargon, text, whatever you want to call it, that the family understands and speaks locally. So we're not coming from US, New York to Sub-Saharan Africa saying, oh, do this, sign here. We're actually using the community in that country to help develop these flip charts, to help develop the tools that we use in addition to the informed consent, which is IRB approved and stamped, et cetera, to make sure that we are all understanding what the study is about, but more importantly, what the family is asking about the risks for themselves, for their child, for enrollment on the study. So a lot of what we do internationally is really focused in country. And all of the tools that we use are also approved by the IRBs. So all the flip charts, all the cartooning, all the stuff that we do, the handouts that we give to the families are exactly approved in country, based on the right language. It's not I didn't write it. It was written that way, translated to English and back so that it passed all the rules. In the US, we are doing similar things. So for many of our sites across the US that are English, Spanish, and Haitian, we have the exact same type of tools. They are a little bit different because they're US-based versus Sub-Saharan Africa or Haiti or India, et cetera, but we are using the same exact approach. And when we do informed consents, we don't just read the consent, we have a specific tool that asks questions of the family in the appropriate language, like, what is a placebo? Because the study had the word placebo in it. What is RSV? Oh, this is an RSV study. What did you understand RSV was? So a lot of the tools that we use are appropriate for the participants who were asked the question to enroll in the study, but are specific to the study and our language and culturally appropriate for the families you enroll. So I want to say, I can tell you over the years that I've been doing it, I have seen big shifts. And I want to say the tools we use now are much cleaner, nicer than the tools we used decades past.
Sara Coggins from CHOP. I had a question sort of in thinking of this and how we balance differing potentially risk-benefit profiles for an intervention on mom versus baby. And it made me think about fetal surgery, particularly like fetal surgery for myelomeningocele or spina bifida, which may confer benefit neurodevelopmentally to the baby, but has zero benefit to the mom and potentially only long-term risk in terms of future pregnancy. And I'm curious as to whether you or the FDA has a framework of thinking about what level of morbidity is acceptable to one party if there is potentially significant benefit to the other party in the maternal-fetal dyad.
I can comment on that a little bit. I think you bring up a great point. I don't think that these guidelines provide what you're asking. And I think that was brought up as a comment and feedback that there wasn't very much in these guidelines that are specific to studies that are for fetal benefit rather than looking at medications in pregnant mothers and lactating women. But I think you bring up a really important point, and one that I think as an maternal fetal medicine physician, we face a lot for just general clinical care, but also really spreads when we're thinking about fetal conditions. Other ones that I might think of that come to mind are fetal arrhythmias, SVT treatment with maternal medications that have no benefit at all to mom, but are used for her to be a conduit to treat the fetus. I think MMC repair that you brought up is also another very good example with the historical use of open procedures really resulting in significant maternal morbidity in both that current pregnancy and subsequent pregnancies. As that has innovated and we can now do those through more minimally invasive approaches, I think the risk benefit now is much more acceptable, at least from my perspective, and I think for many physicians who are counseling on this, but I do think it's a hard balance. I also, as someone who counsels these mothers on the maternal side with many of you colleagues on the neonatal side, many women who are coming for a fetal surgery are very dedicated to the fetal intervention and are often very willing to accept high morbidity for themselves. And sometimes I think almost myself or other physicians on the maternal side sometimes have to really push, making sure there's a good understanding of the maternal risk. And I think that is something that's really hard in a clinical trial environment to get at. I think for many fetal interventions, some of those have run away from us, if you will, and are outside of clinical trials now or outside of studies and are just being done. But I think really trying to bring some of those practices back to a study environment to really balance those risks and benefits is necessary. But I don't have a good answer other than to agree that it is complicated.
Make a comment that's the purpose of this guidance, right, is to bring the risk benefit into a study situation and not into an open use situation where you would potentially have more potential for harm or a higher number of people using the drug with little data in an uncontrolled environment where you're not following up and capturing these things. So I think that's one of the purposes of this.
And I would just add, I think, in the fetal context it's a little bit different, but for all of these other drugs that we're talking about that have innovated over the years, but excluding pregnant and lactating individuals, those patients we're seeing all the time in clinic, right? And they've been on XYZ drug for their migraines, for their MS, for their anticoagulation, and now they're pregnant. And someone has told them to stop all those meds, and they show up in my office. And so clinically, I would much rather us be producing large amounts of data to be able to really provide a meaningful conversation about risks and benefits instead of having to say, well, in this animal study that we can find, we think it's not at risk or it is. And so yes, this is, every single day for me personally in my life in counseling patients that I think would be so improved by the robust data that could be produced.
I think we may have time for one final question online. It's from Catherine Totten. She says, can additional data to inform drug recommendations in lactations be gleaned in creative ways, such as in mothers of newly weaned children, lactating mothers with indication against lactation, or surrogates? This would mean no risk if baby never takes the milk. I saw a brief statement in the ICH guidance to this effect, but was wondering if additional avenues exist.
I can start with that. I think yesterday there was a presentation from the University of Utah from Dr. Job about rivaroxaban and us doing some pilot work. And for that study, most of our participants were patients who were weaning and agreed to participate. So I actually think that's a really high yield population. We also partnered in that particular example with a local milk bank, and there are quite a few women who had finished were weaning or in the process of weaning, but were coming to donate milk, who were also very interested in participating. So I guess broadly, I would say yes. I think there's a lot of opportunistic and creative ways to connect with patients and women who are weaning or are not opting to breastfeed. That was brought up earlier for potential early colostrum expression in just the first 24 hours after delivery for those who aren't planning to breastfeed. The downside of that is that you don't have the paired neonatal samples, and so for some medications and long-term study, we would want those. But for maternal-only data around plasma and then milk, that's very much a viable option and used, I think, already.
Jocelyn, you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that because as we have been, number one, FDA has lactation guidance. Number two, in that guidance, it also allows for the various combinations or approaches to basically study the lactation data or what the amount of drug that actually ends up in the breast milk, of which one of the allowances also would be for the women that are lactating, not necessarily with like that early colostrum data unless they wanted to, or have other means of like feeding their baby or like, even pumping and freezing their milk for later to be able to give to the baby, but not giving the amount of milk that they're going to be giving to in a phase 1 study environment. But basically, like, there are other approaches around it to gain data, and I think that there are this subpopulation of healthy women who don't have disease that would be really willing to participate in phase 1 studies to be able to provide that data for lactation for the greater the population of lactating women as well. So that being said, I do know that some of the comments were not necessarily, I mean, they might be still actively breastfeeding, but not yet weaning, because weaning would then be slightly different in terms of the kinetics, possibly, of the concentrations that are in the breast milk as well. But certainly that's another way around, another possibility as well, creatively. Yep.
All right, and that will conclude our session. We're going to take a quick break and return at 3 p.m. But before we do so, please give our panelists and our moderators a round of applause.